Alright, so today we are testing the RX 5700 XT in The Last of Us Part 1 on PC. Immediately, we're not really off to a good start. Anyway, we are pairing this with a 12400F CPU, and that's got 16 gigabytes of DDR4, 3200 megahertz CL16 memory. Right, so not the most powerful CPU nor the fastest memory, but it gets the job done for these mid-range GPU benchmarks. And today we'll be testing at 1080p and 1440p. I can't get this game to actually run properly in 4K with this GPU, but that's to be expected. All right, let's just start our counter there. Now, if you have a look at the top left-hand corner there, I've got a few additional items there. I've got VRAM allocation and VRAM used separated. Now, this is according to MSI Afterburner. It might not be 100% accurate, but it does give you a good idea. Now, just one thing that I want to point out, the shader compilation with this 12400F CPU actually took 47 minutes. It reached 27%, and then the game crashed. I had to restart the game, but luckily the shader compilation continued at 28%. Then loading into the game took pretty much forever as well, which is pretty strange because according to the recommended specifications, the RX 5700 XT is listed there. It's actually an RX 5800 XT, which I don't even think exists. But according to the Steam recommended, 5700 XT is recommended for 1080p gaming. Now, once I actually managed to get into the game, it auto set all the settings to medium/low, and FSR performance was enabled by default. Now, that I just find that very strange that we pretty much meet the recommended requirements when it comes to the GPU, and we exceed it with the CPU, yet the game wants us to run at FSR performance at 1080p. I'm just going to be running this same area that I did in my previous benchmark, just to keep it consistent. But here you can see at 1080p Ultra, sorry, I probably had to mention that this is at 1080p Ultra at the moment. We are getting more or less 60 frames per second constant. There are a few stutters, and I think that's due to VRAM. Even though it's not really going above 8 gigs for the VRAM usage, it does seem to be VRAM limited in some way. As when we go down to medium or high, the stutters seem to be a lot better. Alright, so this was at 1080p Ultra, as I said. Let's see how it does at 1080p High. Now, yeah, you can see that at 1080p Ultra, it says that we are overshooting our VRAM by 38%. Right, even at high, it still says we're about 3% over. Right, but that's just an estimate, so no real worries there. And now we're at 1080p High. I think you can, there we go. So you can see we gained about 15 to 20 frames per second, 10 to 15 frames per second maybe. The game does feel a bit better. The frame time graph looks a little bit smoother, and our VRAM usage is quite a bit lower. The game still looks pretty good at high settings. The texture detail seems to deteriorate quite a bit as soon as you go down from high to medium. So I don't think it's worth it to lower it to medium. The textures just look completely washed out. Don't mind the GPU temperature. This is pretty normal for this time of year in South Africa. That's pretty warm inside the room that I'm recording in. We have load shedding, so I can't even turn on the AC. So this is pretty much what we are stuck with at the moment. Luckily, the performance is not really affected that much by the GPU temperature. We are still seeing the clock speeds exceed 2 gigahertz. Alright, so 1080p High, we had an average of about 76 frames per second, and our 0.1% lows are sitting at an impressive 60 frames per second. Now, I know that my previous video seemed to be the odd one out. A lot of reviewers and a lot of people online actually complain about the performance of this game. I didn't do anything special. I just let the shaders compile completely before I started the game, and this is the performance that I'm getting. Even on a pretty budget-oriented build, we are seeing a pretty decent performance here. And by pretty decent performance, I mean relatively speaking. The 1% and 0.1% lows are pretty good, so it means that there were very little stuttering. Alright, let's see what happens at 1080p medium. Right, so even at 1080p medium, it's complaining about possible VRAM issues. Not entirely sure about this because, as I said, this is supposed to be recommended for 1080p high. So definitely something either not right with the the graphical settings here or the system requirements are just completely off, which wouldn't surprise me at all. All right, let's just get our numbers up here again. Let's reset those numbers. And we didn't gain anything. We're still in the 80s, yeah. This is pretty much what we had earlier, but you can just see that the textures, they are just completely missing. Just have a look at his backpack, his shirt. Like, it just looks extremely bland. Right, we seem to have gained a few FPS when it comes to the highs. In this area, we are almost hitting 100 frames per second. But personally, I don't think the trade-off is worth it. I'd rather play at 70 frames per second and the game look pretty decent than have it run at 9 frames per second and it looks like this. Not ideal. One thing about this game is the reflections are pretty good. This is not ray traced reflections, but the reflections seem to be pretty accurate. Remember, this is at medium. We'll switch to high just now. If there's some missed frames here, it's not really missed frames, it looks like it, but the mouse I'm using seems to be some interference here with the wireless mouse. Not sure exactly what's causing it, but anyway, it is what it is. All right, so I'll be testing now at 1080p high with FSR. We're not going to be testing at ultra because we are definitely VRAM limited with the ultra preset even at 1080p. Right, we're now still at 1080p. I enabled the high preset and now we're just enabling FSR to quality. And I just swapped out my mouse. This is just so much better. So we are getting pretty much what we had at 1080p medium, but the graphics just look so much better. Let's just reset the numbers there if I can get the right combination going. I'm getting around 100 frames per second in this specific area. I know that the frame rate would be different in different areas. I mean, it's inevitable. We can't test each and every single scene or scenario. So you're just pretty much stuck with what I'm doing here. You can see that our VRAM usage also reduced quite a bit by enabling FSR because we are now rendering internally at 720p. The GPU usage is still stuck at pretty much 100%, which is good, which means we are GPU bound and not CPU bound. The CPU is pretty heavily utilized here. It's actually running quite warm for gaming. This is on a stock cooler that comes with the 12400F. So no real surprises there as long as it stays under 100 degrees Celsius. We should be fine. But you can see that the CPU utilization is pretty much stuck at the 70s, right? All right, that's going to be it for our 1080p testing. Just one thing with FSR, you can see there the telephone line or power line, whatever it is, it's missing some detail. It just looks like there's definitely some parts missing, and as you move it gets more obvious. But that's unfortunately the trade-off with upscaling. This is not true for all FSR or upscaling implementations. It's just in some games it's a little bit more obvious than others. All right, so as I said, this is going to be it for our 1080p testing. Let's see what we can do at 1440p. Right, we're now at 1440p on the Ultra preset, and our VRAM warning here turned into an alert. I mean, red is just not good. Previously it was yellow, just warning us, but this is now a little bit more than it can handle. Right, 1440p Ultra, no FSR. I don't think this is going to go well, but let's give it a bash anyway. It's not terrible. If we're having a look at the frame rate there, getting around 40 frames per second. Our VRAM allocation and usage is still pretty much stuck there in the 7.6 and 7.2 gigabytes respectively. It seems to be doing okay. So maybe the VRAM allocated and VRAM usage, either those numbers are incorrect or the game menu just overestimates what the settings would use. And it's maybe just playing it on the safe side. But we're not really noticing many stutters here. It's probably because the game has fully loaded into memory, and once you start entering new areas, the stutters might increase, but it seems to be pretty okay for now. Right, even 1440p high gives us a warning here, 22% over our allotted VRAM, but I think we should be okay. I mean, we were pretty okay at 1440p Ultra, but okay, our frame rate did increase quite a bit. We are getting closer to that 60 frames per second. Highly doubt that we'll hit it even at medium. But this is definitely not a terrible experience, considering this GPU launched in 2019. So it's around 4 years old now. It was made to be a competitor to the 1080 Ti, which actually came out in 2017. So Technically, it's competing with a GPU that is 6 years old at this stage, and it seems to hold up pretty well in new titles. I mean, sure, we're still getting quite a low frame rate here, considering this GPU can definitely perform a lot better at 1440p in different games, but this port just does not seem to be that well optimized. All right, you can see that from our 0.1% low number, we did have a pretty big stutter, but all in all, the gameplay was pretty okay. Now, let's see what happens at 1440p medium. Right, so even at 1440p medium, it's warning us about possible VRAM usage, but let's go for it. Now, I don't think you should be playing at medium, as I said earlier. The performance gains aren't really that great, and the visual fidelity does decrease quite a bit. As we had a look at the textures earlier, I just don't think it's worth it. Rather play on high, and if you're not satisfied with the frame rate, then let's just use FSR, which we'll test just now. Now, the funny thing here is this GPU is drawing about 200 watts. It's getting quite warm, and we are getting around 60 frames per second. Now, the 4070 Ti that I actually tested a few days ago, that's also drawing around 200 watts. If I power limit it to 60%, it draws around 170 watts, and it's more than twice as fast as this GPU. Sure, it's a much newer GPU, etc. I'm just referring to the power efficiency. All right, so now we had an average of around 64 frames per second. Our 1% and 0.1% lows are pretty respectable, pretty close to that average, and that's what you want for a consistent gameplay experience. All right, I'm going to go to 1440p high and enable FSR again. Let's see what happens. Right, we're now at 1440p high, and FSR quality has been enabled. Let's just get our benchmark run going here. And I think we should be able to maintain 60 frames per second most of the time anyway. This part here seems to be the more intensive part of my benchmark, or more demanding part of my benchmark. The tunnels seem to be quite light, so yeah, we should see the higher numbers around 70, 75 there is, and once we get into this open space here again, the frame rate should drop. But I do think we'll stay above 60, and I think we did pretty well there. All right, so if you have this GPU, oh, there we dropped into 57. Still, this is a pretty good experience. 60 frames per second is more than enough for a game like this. Remember, it was released on the PS3 first, and then relaunched on the PS4, and then relaunched again on the PS5, and now relaunched on the PC. But my point is that it was made for 30/60 frames per second gameplay. So 60 frames per second on PC with keyboard and mouse, input latency is definitely acceptable. So the 60 frames per second should be good enough. All right, I don't think we'll be doing too well at 4K. I'm going to do one test. I'm just going to go into 4K low, and let's see what the performance is like. It actually loaded. Now this is still with FSR. Now let's disable FSR. I'm not sure if the game is going to crash or not. All right. And this is exactly what happens once you start running out of VRAM. We're getting to 22 frames per second, but once it starts running out of VRAM, you'll see it go down into the single digits there. This is actually better than I expected. This is on the high preset, actually. We didn't go down too low. So 4K, and there you go, the VRAM issue. Right, so that's exactly what happens once you run out of VRAM. It just reverts to system memory, and system memory is a lot slower than dedicated VRAM on the GPU itself, and it's also got a further distance to travel. Right, so 4K, I don't think it's going to be possible on this GPU. I mean, we can try and mitigate this with FSR, but I'd stick to 1440p with FSR or 1080p native if you have the 5700 XT. All right, let's just see if we can get the frame rate high enough for me to do my outro. 10 frames per second is good enough. All right, so that's going to be it for this video. Thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and as always, we hope to see you in the next one.